The raid on David's office made the morning news. Sarah watched from a secure location as FBI agents carried out boxes of servers and hard drives. His carefully constructed digital empire, built on the pain of countless women, was being dismantled piece by piece. But the real bombshell was yet to drop. "We found the blackmail files," Marcus reported through their encrypted channel. "Not just Emma and Maya's, dozens of them. He kept everything, Sarah. Every threat, every manipulated photo, every piece of stolen data. His arrogance is going to bury him." David's response was swift and brutal. His expensive legal team filed motions to suppress evidence, claiming illegal surveillance. They painted Sarah as a vengeful ex-fiancé who had orchestrated a complex conspiracy to destroy an innocent man's life. Local news outlets, fed carefully crafted leaks, began questioning Sarah's motives. Then Emma stepped forward. The courthouse fell silent as Emma detailed 3 years of manipulation and blackmail. Her voice shook, but never wavered as she described how David had systematically isolated her, using her daughter's vulnerability as a weapon. "I betrayed my cousin, my husband, my family," she testified. "I'll live with that shame forever, but I won't let him hurt anyone else." More survivors emerged. A former colleague described how David had destroyed her career after she rejected him. A college girlfriend revealed how he'd forced her to drop out and move cities through relentless harassment. Each story showed the same pattern: the charm, the manipulation, the devastating consequences of resistance. David's composure finally cracked during cross-examination. When Sarah's lawyer presented evidence of his stalking network, his mask of innocence shattered. "They deserved it," he shouted, eyes blazing with the same rage Sarah had glimpsed at the engagement party. "These ungrateful women, thinking they can just walk away." The outburst made headlines. David's legal team scrambled to do damage control, but the footage spread rapidly. His corporate clients began distancing themselves as evidence emerged of his technology being used for widespread surveillance and harassment. Tom, Emma's husband, provided the final piece of evidence. "I found these in our garden shed," he told investigators, handing over a box of old hard drives. They contained years of David's communications with other stalkers, sharing techniques and targeting vulnerable women. The investigation expanded into a multi-state federal case. Sarah watched David's empire crumble from her hotel room, surrounded by her support team. Mrs. Chen monitored police channels while Marcus traced the digital fallout. Rachel coordinated with other survivors, ensuring everyone stayed safe during the chaos. "He's trying to access your old accounts again," Marcus announced, tracking David's desperate attempts to regain control. "But he's making mistakes. Every attempt leaves more evidence." Sarah smiled grimly. "Let him try," she said, thinking of all the women who had lived in fear of this man. "Everything he does now just makes our case stronger." The final battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. David had spent years playing chess with people's lives, never realizing he was being positioned for a devastating checkmate. The first red flag appeared 3 days after the confrontation. Sarah's laptop started behaving strangely, files opening on their own, the cursor moving without her touch. She'd been expecting some form of retaliation, but David's technical expertise had surprised her. The ET specialist she consulted found sophisticated spyware buried deep in her system, installed months ago through their shared cloud account. "I just want to talk," David's messages read, flooding her inbox from new email addresses faster than she could block them. "You're overreacting. We can work this out." But it was the message from Emma that made her blood run cold. "You need to be careful. There's something you don't know about David." They met in a crowded cafe 2 cities away. Emma's hands shook as she pulled out her phone, showing Sarah a folder of screenshots. "He started blackmailing me a year ago," she whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "He found out about Maya's secret Instagram account, the one where she was talking to older men. She's only 15, Sarah. He threatened to send everything to her school, to child services." Sarah's coffee turned bitter in her mouth as Emma continued. The affair had started consensually, but David's behavior grew increasingly controlling. He demanded Emma's passwords, tracked her location, and used her daughter's vulnerability as leverage to keep her silent. I wanted to end it so many times, Emma sobbed. But he had all these photos, all this evidence he threatened to show Tom. He enjoyed watching me squirm at family gatherings, making me play the excited cousin for your wedding. That night, Sarah discovered her home security system had been disabled. The cameras she'd installed showed David entering her apartment while she was meeting Emma, methodically going through her belongings. He'd taken nothing, but left subtle signs of his presence. Her jewelry box slightly askew, her diary moved to a different drawer. The message was clear: nowhere was safe. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "How was coffee with Emma? That green sweater looks lovely on you." Attached was a photo of her and Emma at the cafe, taken from across the street. Sarah's hands trembled as she called her lawyer. As she described the escalating harassment, a pattern emerged that terrified her. David hadn't just been a cheating fiancé, he was a calculating predator who had spent years perfecting his manipulation techniques. The final revelation came from a private investigator she hired. David's previous relationships ended abruptly, with the women moving away, changing jobs, disappearing from social media. One had filed a restraining order but mysteriously withdrew it. When Sarah tracked her down, the woman's words chilled her. "If you're calling about David, change your number, move cities, and pray he finds someone else to obsess over. Otherwise, you'll never be free." As Sarah stared at her reflection that night, she barely recognized herself. The confident woman who had orchestrated the garden confrontation was gone, replaced by someone who jumped at shadows. But in her eyes, a steely determination began to form. If this was war, she would not be fighting it alone. Sarah stood in her empty apartment, laptop open to a Zillow listing for a Seattle condo. She knew David was watching through the spyware he thought she hadn't discovered on her backup computer. "Perfect," she said aloud, knowing her words would reach him. "The view is exactly what I'm looking for." She clicked through more Seattle properties, deliberately leaving her search history intact. The plan was working. Within hours, David's burner phone pinged a cell tower near a Seattle real estate office. Mrs. Chen's police contacts confirmed he'd booked a flight to Washington for the following week. Classic misdirection. The retired detective smiled, reviewing the tracking data. "He's so convinced of his own brilliance, he never considered you might be playing him." Sarah's actual escape route was taking shape in encrypted messages and cash transactions. Her company's Hong Kong office had approved her transfer request, buried under layers of confidentiality agreements. But first, she needed to spring the trap that would ensure David couldn't follow. The mistake came exactly as Mrs. Chen predicted. David's obsession with monitoring Sarah's Seattle plans made him careless with his own digital footprint. He slipped up during a late-night hack attempt on her email, accidentally using his main IP address instead of a VPN. Marcus captured everything. "We've got him," Marcus announced during their secure video call. The malware he used matches samples from dozens of other stalking cases. "Women in 3 states have been trying to prove he's behind the harassment. Your logs are the missing link." But David had one last card to play. Sarah's work email exploded with allegations of corporate espionage. Doctored screenshots showed her supposedly sharing confidential data, all time-stamped during her relationship with David. Her access to company servers was suspended pending investigation. "He's trying to destroy your credibility before you can expose him," her lawyer explained. But he made a crucial error. The metadata in David's fabricated evidence contained traces of the same digital fingerprints as his stalking tools. The HR investigation was becoming a criminal one. Sarah walked into an emergency board meeting armed with a devastating counterattack. She hadn't just documented David's harassment. She'd uncovered his entire operation. The board sat in stunned silence as she revealed how David had been selling corporate secrets to competitors, using his ET consulting business as cover for his stalking network. "Your Seattle apartment search spooked him," Mrs. Chen explained later. "He panicked, tried to neutralize you the only way he had left. Instead, he gave us everything we needed." That evening, Sarah stood at her window, watching David's familiar car lurking in the shadows. For once, his presence didn't fill her with dread. Tomorrow, Federal agents would raid his office, but he was too busy watching her pack for Seattle to notice the net closing around him. Her phone buzzed. A message from Maya. "Mom's ready. All the evidence is backed up. It's time." Sarah Chen stifled a yawn as she settled into her seat in the company's glass-walled conference room. Another mandatory training session, this time on cybersecurity and digital footprints. As the presenter, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, began discussing cloud storage vulnerabilities, Sarah's thoughts drifted to her upcoming wedding. Just 3 months until she'd walk down the aisle toward David, her fiancé of 8 months and partner of 5 years. "Let's try a practical exercise," the presenter announced, jolting Sarah from her daydream. "Access your cloud storage accounts, and we'll walk through some basic security audits." Sarah logged into her shared account with David, something they'd set up when they moved in together 2 years ago. It seemed romantic at the time, this digital merging of their lives. Following the presenter's instructions, Sarah navigated through hidden folders and file pathways she'd never noticed before. Her cursor hovered over a folder labeled Work Projects 2023. Strange. David kept his work files on his company's secure server. Curiosity piqued, she clicked. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Instead of work documents, she found herself staring at hundreds of WhatsApp message screenshots between David and her cousin Emma. Her throat constricted as she caught fragments of conversations. "Last night was incredible. I hate lying to Sarah, but we need to be more careful." With trembling fingers, Sarah checked the timestamps. The first message was dated exactly 1 week after she'd introduced them at her parents' anniversary party. 3 years ago, her stomach lurched as she realized this meant the affair had been going on longer than her engagement. The presenter's voice faded to a distant buzz as Sarah mechanically clicked through more files. There were photos, nothing explicit, but intimate enough to make her feel physically ill. Coffee dates at obscure cafes. Stolen moments in Emma's garden. A selfie of them at a restaurant Sarah recognized, taken on a night when David had claimed to be working late. A memory surfaced, Emma's constant presence at their engagement party, offering to help with wedding preparations, insisting on being part of every decision. "We're practically sisters," she'd said, hugging Sarah tightly. The recollection now felt like a knife twisting in her gut. Sarah's laptop screen blurred as tears threatened to fall. She blinked them back furiously, aware of her colleagues seated nearby. The irony wasn't lost on her, discovering her fiancé's betrayal during a corporate security training. A hysterical laugh bubbled in her throat, but she swallowed it down. As the presenter moved on to discussing digital privacy, Sarah began taking careful screenshots of her own, documenting everything. The methodical action helped steady her hands. She'd always prided herself on being level-headed in crisis situations. This was just another problem to solve, she told herself, even as her engagement ring felt suddenly heavy on her finger. The rest of the seminar passed in a haze, but Sarah's mind was crystallizing into sharp clarity. This wasn't just about the affair. It was about 3 years of calculated deception from the 2 people she trusted most. As she closed her laptop, Sarah knew with cold certainty that her response would need to be equally calculated. That evening, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, practicing her smile until it looked convincing. The ivory roses would be perfect for the centerpieces, don't you think? She rehearsed, watching her reflection for any hint of the rage simmering beneath her carefully constructed mask. The woman staring back at her looked every bit the excited bride-to-be, despite having spent the last hour vomiting after her discovery. The next 2 weeks became an elaborate performance worthy of an Oscar. Sarah attended cake tastings with David, nodding enthusiastically as he suggested their flavors. "The chocolate ganache is divine," she'd say, while secretly photographing his hand, casually resting on Emma's lower back when he thought no one was watching. Every shared glance between them, every accidental touch, every hushed conversation, Sarah documented it all. The wedding venue tours were particularly excruciating. As David and Emma discussed flower arrangements, her dear cousin having volunteered to be the wedding planner, Sarah noticed their inside jokes, the loaded pauses in their conversations. She watched Emma's husband Tom beam proudly at his wife's dedication to their family event. completely oblivious to the betrayal unfolding before him. "You seem distracted lately, babe," David mentioned one evening, wrapping his arms around her waist. Sarah suppressed a shudder, remembering the messages she'd found where he'd used the same endearment with Emma. Instead, she leaned into his embrace and smiled. "Just wedding stress," she replied, her voice steady despite her thundering heart. The breaking point almost came during their engagement photoshoot planning. Emma had suggested using her prized garden as the backdrop, the same garden where Sarah had discovered multiple photos of clandestine meetings. "It's so romantic there," Emma gushed, not meeting Sarah's eyes. "The rose arbor would make a perfect frame for your love story." Sarah watched David's face carefully as he enthusiastically agreed. There it was, that fleeting micro-expression of guilt, quickly masked by artificial enthusiasm. She'd been studying their faces like a detective, learning to read the subtle tells she'd been blind to for years. "That's perfect," Sarah heard herself say, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. "After all, Emma's garden has been so significant to our relationship." She savored the momentary panic that flashed across both their faces, too quick for others to notice. In her private moments, Sarah meticulously organized her evidence. Screenshots, photos, video clips from security cameras she'd quietly installed, credit card statements showing matching locations and timestamps. Each piece of evidence felt like another. Sarah sat in the back row of a dimly lit community center, listening to stories that eerily mirrored her own. The support group for survivors of relationship abuse had seemed like a last resort, but as a woman named Rachel described her ex-husband's digital stalking campaign, Sarah felt her isolation beginning to crack. After the meeting, Rachel introduced her to Marcus, a cybersecurity expert who specialized in helping abuse survivors. "Smart homes are a stalker's playground," he explained, scanning Sarah's phone. "David didn't just install spyware. He's integrated himself into every aspect of your digital life. The smart thermostat, doorbell camera, even her car's GPS system, all compromised." "You're actually lucky," Marcus said, his fingers flying over his keyboard. "Most abusers aren't this sophisticated." David's overconfidence in his technical skills makes him sloppy. He's leaving digital fingerprints everywhere. Together, they began building a documentation system that turned David's surveillance against him. Meanwhile, Emma's teenage daughter Maya reached out through an encrypted messaging app. "Mom finally told me everything," she wrote. "But there's more. I found old posts on a tech forum David used to help guys spy on their ex-girlfriends. He'd brag about it. Some of the stories. Maya's messages revealed a pattern stretching back to David's college years, where he perfected his manipulation techniques. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, no relation, turned out to be a retired detective. "I've been watching that young man skulking around," she said over tea one afternoon. "He's making amateur mistakes. Too confident, too visible." Mrs. Chen began teaching Sarah counter-surveillance techniques, drawing from decades of experience. A network formed around Sarah. Rachel's tech-savvy brother helped secure her devices. Another support group member, a lawyer specializing in cyberstalking cases, offered legal guidance. Emma, working to redeem herself, provided crucial evidence of David's blackmail tactics. The daily discoveries were horrifying. David had created detailed dossiers on Sarah's friends and family, looking for pressure points. He'd mapped her entire routine, noting every vulnerability. But each revelation strengthened Sarah's resolve and her support system's determination. "He's escalating," Mrs. Chen warned one evening, after catching David attempting to install a hidden camera in Sarah's parking garage. "But he's also getting desperate. Desperate men make mistakes." That night, Sarah received an anonymous email with files documenting David's involvement in a coordinated harassment network. The sender identified herself only as a previous victim. "We've been watching him for years," she wrote, "waiting for someone strong enough to bring him down. You're not alone anymore." For the first time since discovering David's betrayal, Sarah felt real hope. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every woman who'd faced David's systematic abuse. As she reviewed the growing evidence with her support team, a plan began to take shape. David thought he was hunting her, but he hadn't realized he was walking into a trap of his own making. 1 year later, Sarah stood at a podium in Singapore's Suntec Convention Center, facing a packed auditorium of cybersecurity professionals and domestic violence advocates. The irony wasn't lost on her. Another conference center, another turning point in her life. But this time she was in control. Technology can be both a weapon and a shield, she began, her voice steady. I learned this firsthand when my ex-fiancé turned my smart home into a prison. But what he intended as a tool of control became the key to his downfall. The presentation screen behind her displayed anonymized chat logs, showing how David's stalking network had been exposed. In the front row, Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. The retired detective had flown in specifically for this conference, where their case study was being presented as a breakthrough in fighting digital abuse. Marcus sat beside her, already fielding questions from other security experts about their counter-surveillance techniques. David's sentencing last month wasn't just about justice for me, Sarah continued. It was about every survivor who found their voice through this case. The federal investigation had uncovered a network of over 50 victims across multiple states. David's 15-year sentence had made headlines, but the real victory was in the precedents set for prosecuting digital abuse. Her phone buzzed during the post-presentation reception, a message from Emma. The cousins had slowly rebuilt their relationship through therapy and shared healing. Emma had become an advocate for teenage internet safety, turning her guilt into purpose. Her daughter Maya was thriving in college, studying computer science with a focus on security. You've got another one, Emma's message read, followed by a link. Someone had posted on a support forum about their boyfriend's controlling behavior. The pattern was familiar: spyware, emotional manipulation, isolation tactics. A year ago, this woman would have been another victim. Now, she was being connected to resources, support networks, and legal aid. Sarah's corporate consulting firm, born from her experience, had already helped dozens of companies strengthen their digital security policies. But it was the pro bono work with survivors that truly fulfilled her. Every person who escaped their abuser was a victory. Every exposed stalker a step toward changing the system. Later that evening, Sarah stood on her apartment balcony, watching Singapore's skyline glitter. Her new home felt secure in a way her old life never had. The last traces of David's influence had been scrubbed from her digital footprint, though she kept secure backups of everything, a reminder and a weapon if ever needed. Her laptop chimed with a video call. Rachel's support group had grown into an international network, meeting virtually to share stories and strategies. Tonight, they were welcoming a new member, someone who had recognized David's tactics in their own relationship and gotten out early. As Sarah joined the call, she felt the familiar surge of purpose. Her story hadn't ended with escape or even justice. It had evolved into something larger. In trying to destroy her, David had instead created a force for change. Every woman he had tried to control was now part of a movement, turning their collective pain into power. The betrayal that was meant to break her had instead forged her into something stronger. Sarah wasn't just a survivor. She was a beacon for others finding their way out of the darkness. And that, she realized, was the greatest victory of all. The garden glowed with hundreds of twinkling lights, transforming Emma's betrayal grounds into a deceptively enchanting venue for the engagement celebration. Fairy lights wrapped around the infamous rose arbor, and elegant champagne flutes sparkled on white-clothed tables. Sarah watched from an upstairs window as guests arrived, noting how Emma fluttered between groups, playing the perfect hostess in her designer dress. David's best man clinked his glass, calling for attention. Time for a special presentation, he announced, winking at David. Right on cue. Sarah's pulse quickened as the projector screen lowered against the garden wall. She'd spent hours editing this video, timing it perfectly. The montage began innocently enough. Photos of Sarah and David's relationship through the years. Their first vacation, holiday celebrations, the proposal. Guests sighed and smiled, while David beamed proudly, his arm draped around Sarah's shoulders. Emma stood near the front, champagne in hand, the perfect picture of cousinly support. Then the tone shifted. Security footage from the garden appeared, showing David and Emma's secret meetings. Screenshots of their messages filled the screen, their words stark against the white background. The timestamp on the first message blinked accusingly. 1 week after their introduction, Sarah felt David's arms stiffen around her as his phone appeared on screen, synced to his iPad, revealing years of deception in brutal detail. "What is this?" David's voice cracked as he jerked away from Sarah. The crowd's murmurs turned to gasps. Emma's champagne flute shattered on the stone path. "I think you know exactly what this is," Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. She turned to face the crowd, her practiced calm finally cracking. "My fiancé and my cousin have been having an affair for 3 years, since the week I introduced them." Tom, Emma's husband, stumbled forward. "Emma!" His face drained of color as more messages appeared on screen. Messages discussing their rendezvous, their lies, their elaborate cover-ups. "I can explain." David grabbed Sarah's arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "It's not what you think. Take your hands off me." Sarah's voice cut like steel. "Or should I show everyone the messages where you joked about how easy it was to fool me?" Emma rushed forward, mascara already streaming. "Sarah, please, we never meant to get caught." Sarah finished, pulling free from David's grip. "That's obvious. You meant to keep lying to my face, to stand beside me at my wedding. To what? Continue this afterward." David's face transformed, rage replacing his mask of contrition. "You manipulative bitch," he snarled, lunging forward. Several guests rushed to intervene, but not before Sarah saw the violence in his eyes. It confirmed every instinct that had led her to hire security for this event. As chaos erupted in the garden, Sarah watched her carefully orchestrated revelation tear through their lives like a tornado. She felt oddly detached, even as her aunt fainted and Tom launched himself at David. The truth was finally out, but she realized this wasn't the end of the storm. It was just the beginning.